All right, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Mindfulness of Grief as part of the Diversity Project's mental health awareness events. I share the floor today with my teacher, Ju Teo, who's a teacher of Hatha Vinyasa Yoga, Qigong, and meditation. Ju started teaching yoga in 2007, back in all those years ago, in China's first dedicated yoga center, and also at Tri Yoga in London. Ju is very well known as someone who teaches accessible and welcoming yoga to all levels of experience. The moment he joins us from France, which was just really impressive. A few years ago, he followed his heart and went off and started a retreat house. It's called the Normandy Retreat House. And as if that isn't enough, he's also recently authored a book called Qigong in Yoga Teaching and Practice, which you can find on his website, juteo.com. I'm Dinesha Mendes. I'm head of RFP at Close Brothers Asset Management. I'm ambassador at the Diversity Project, but I'm also founder of Sunday Unplugged, which is a private well-being events business. I'm a yoga and mindfulness teacher, and I've trained in the Shivananda tradition and also in restorative yoga at Tri Yoga here in London. So today it's great to see the numbers come up. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. And please make sure you grab yourself a notepad and a pen. We've come here today to talk about grief. The pandemic has been a very, very unique experience for all of us. And each and every one of us has lived a very different experience. But one story that's very clear to me that really weaves through all of us is that we're all grieving. We're all grieving in one way or another. We'll be spending our time today looking at what exactly grief is. I found that an understanding of grief and awareness of grief is really what can tie into a healing mindfulness practice. I'll be sharing a little bit on the stages of grief, on the types of grief, and then also some useful models that I've learned about in academic research. I will then have the great pleasure of handing over to Ju, who will share with us some teachings on how to give yourself permission to grieve, some tools, and also how to write your own prescription on managing grief and trauma. So, grief is the experience of losing anything we form a strong emotional connection to. This can be a loved family member, a pet, our friends, or a lifestyle. And what I'll be doing today is to give you an overview of grief so that you can integrate this into your own learning, into your own field of awareness, and therefore into your mindfulness practice. My dialogue with grief has been a long journey, but it really came to a turning point on a November evening in 2018. I was wearing a long, beautiful, brand new blue cocktail dress. And I had spent 1 hour fixing my hair that day, and I had brand new earrings. And I was now waiting for my friend Nick to come and pick me up. We were in Bali, one of the most beautiful places in the whole world. And I was sleeping in one of the most beautiful bungalows I've ever been on. It was really luxurious, and there were fragrant frangipani trees outside. So when I opened the door to go down the little trail to the beach, there were these fragrant flower petals just lying around, the sea of flowers, on the pathway to the beach. I had flown to Bali to give myself 10 days off. And on this evening, this was very monumental because I was going for dinner with Nick, a nice guy from Cornwall who was now living in Bali. We'd met on a flight 2 years ago and had a really great conversation and felt very connected to each other. And I promised that one day I was going to fly all the way to Bali to be with him, spend some time with him, get to know him better. So here we are. It's that big evening. We're going to go for dinner finally. Nick shows up and he's there with his motorbike. I get on the back of the motorbike and we start riding through the humid, mild, comfortable air of Bali. It was one of those evenings where you step out and your skin feels different. You know you're somewhere else. You know you're on holiday. You're on the back of a motorbike. The wind is flowing through your hair and you feel very, very free. The evening lay ahead of us as we rode under the starlit sky. My phone rang as we were riding through the night, but I wasn't able to answer it because the roar of the motorbike was so loud. Once we arrived at the restaurant, Italian, it rang again, and I picked up the phone this time. It was my mother, crying. "Your father has died," she said, weeping. And just like that, everything changed. I don't even remember dropping the phone, but apparently I did. And just like that, the evening was over. Now, I've always been a big fan of having goals and having plans, of having a vision of where you want your life to go. But making plans is not for the faint-hearted. Life will come in and to slap you down and throw something else your way. I heard as a child that if you ever want to make God laugh, tell him your plans. 2 hours later, I was on a flight back to London, and about 20 hours later, I walked into the living room where my father's dead body had lain. He had closed his eyes and gone to sleep, and as the post-mortem results revealed 6 weeks later, he died of a stroke, like he always wanted. He always wanted to just close his eyes and go to sleep. It was a peaceful death. My dad had been ill for 3 years. He battled dementia. So a part of me was actually quite relieved that it was over and that he was no longer suffering. But my journey with grief did not begin that evening when I got the phone call on the back of a motorbike. My journey with grief began a very, very, very long time ago, probably when I was a teenager, actually. At this point, I remembered being abused as a child, as a very young child, and I began grieving my childhood. Also then as a teenager, my best friend committed suicide. So I then had to learn how to grieve him, the fact that he died. I didn't quite know how to process these things. And later on, this dialogue with grief continued. My grandparents died. I lost my aunts and uncles, who I love very much, and especially my godfather, who I was really, really close to. Now, the thing with my dad was a different thing, because the biggest insight that I got from this was when he was diagnosed with dementia, because I couldn't quite process how to deal with this living death. Dad was fading in front of my eyes. He was dying in front of my eyes for many, many years. And what I was going through was very complicated and painful. And I had to find a way now as a trained mindfulness practitioner to find my own healing and to find my own path. So for me, the answer here was that I had to be uncompromisingly curious about grief. So I just want to share up front, there's quite a lot of you on this call. Welcome to anyone who's just joined. I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a trained counselor. The only qualifications I have is that I'm a trained yoga teacher, a mindfulness teacher, I'm a Reiki master, and a mental health first aider. But most importantly, aside from engaging in these modalities of well-being, I'm a human being, and I'm a human being who's experienced grief. Now, something that I've realized over the years is that grief is one of the most misunderstood emotions. We tend to think of grief, especially when it's related to death, as something that you need to solve. And also the focus is really just on death, but there's actually lots and lots of types of loss. So in this pandemic, we had 127,000 people more than die in the UK. So it's very likely that there's people on this call who've lost someone. But we've also lost our lives. We lost the lives as we knew it, and we lost our existence. We lost the way of living in the way that we knew it. And no one will ever give it back to us the same way again. So one of the most fascinating things that I've found is that when I began learning about the different types of grief, that this itself was a very powerful thing. I was able to support myself, but I was also able to be more mindful with what other people were going through. So there were sort of 3 angles that I wanted to cover in today's session. One is the different stages of grief. So if you sort of think of it as different steps that can happen. Secondly, there's the different types of grief. So these are the sort of shapes or colors of grief, if you think of this as another layer. But lastly, there's a few really basic, useful models and ideas that have been published in widely recognized academic research. So let's start at the bottom. Grief is a strong emotion that appears when we face loss. Grief can show up when we lose anything that we form a strong emotional connection to, and it's usually linked to identity, freedom, or expectation. The emotion of grief is a natural response, and it's part of the process. Something that I've heard many years ago, and you'll probably know about this yourself, are the 5 stages of grief model published by the Swiss-American psychiatrist Elisabeth Kübler-Ross in the 1960s. She identifies 5 emotions: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. So denial is an early reaction. So in the pandemic, I noticed that a lot of my friends could just not process what was happening with this pandemic. It just wasn't really happening. They were not listening to the data, they were not listening to the news, and they didn't want to accept that there were now rules around self-isolation and staying at home in quarantine. There was a lot of people in severe denial over what had just happened. Then the second stage was anger. Now, this is where an individual recognizes that the denial can't continue, and they become very frustrated, especially at people close to them. There'll be questions like, why me? It's not fair. And how can this happen? And many of you might have experienced that as well in the pandemic, that there were bursts of anger or periods of anger where people around you were going through this. Bargaining is the third stage, and this involves hope where the individual thinks they can avoid the source of grief. So an example would be that a terminally ill person with cancer, might negotiate with God and say, listen, I just need to live like 3 more months because I want to make it to my daughter's wedding. The fourth stage is depression, which I think most people are very well aware of. So here, someone will despair at the recognition of loss. And in this stage, people may become silent, they might become withdrawn, and they might want to spend their time very mournful and sullen. The fifth stage of grief is acceptance. And here we're sort of getting to the point of, it's going to be okay. I can't fight it, but I'm going to get used to this. And here is where you start embracing your reality. You accept that your life has changed. And even though this is reluctant, with this comes a natural stability of emotions. Now, those are the different stages of grief, and I'll go into that. I'll touch back on this later today, but there's also different types of grief, and you can really go into a massive rabbit hole here. I'm not going to try to cover everything I've read on grief. There's so much academic research on it, and I do invite you to go off and find it yourself. There's people doing PhDs on grief. But the other thing I've discovered is that people have identified 8 types of grief. So these are the sort of shapes and colors of grief. Those 8 types, I'm not going to go into all of them, I'll go into 4, are anticipatory grief, delayed grief, complex, exaggerated, normal, inhibited, disenfranchised, and absent. Today, I'll just briefly focus on anticipatory, normal, complicated, and absent grief. So first of all, there's the anticipation of loss. So this means it's possible for you to feel grief before the loss actually happens. So in my case, as I said, my dad was diagnosed, and I knew that we now had a very limited amount of years for him to live. It meant that my grief process started the minute I got the diagnosis. I found this very complex over the years because you have to see someone suffering and you see them die in front of your eyes. But because I knew that I was experiencing anticipatory grief, I also had a much healthier outcome to when he actually died. I didn't feel guilty about the fact that I felt relieved that it was now over. Some people say that with anticipatory grief, the actual event of loss, that the impact is much lower. So some people argue, okay, well, you knew you were going to get fired, so when it finally happened, you didn't think it was a big deal, or you knew you were getting divorced, so the day you had to hand over the keys to your house to the estate agent, you were prepared. But I don't think it's that easy. And a lot of the science actually disagrees with this as well. The second type of grief is common grief. And this is where people carry on with their complete regular routines despite feelings of grief. From the outside, it looks like they're doing absolutely fine. They wake up, they go to work, they do the dishes. They don't look affected, but nevertheless, they're in severe pain and they have severe numbness. And they also have very overwhelming feelings that take over under this normal facade. Here, it's quite common for there to be bursts of grief. So I too have experienced this, where you're kind of cracking on with stuff from Monday to Friday, but when it comes to Saturday morning, suddenly you wake up with palpitations and are completely overwhelmed. The third type of grief is complex grief. I was diagnosed with this by a professional 6 months after my father had died. It's only a very small amount of people that have this. And it means that the grief is so overwhelming, in my case, it hit me much later, that it prevents a person from going on with their normal lives. So one example is that with complicated grief, a characteristic is that there's avoidance behavior. So you might want to avoid things that remind you of your experience of the trauma. In my case, I could no longer do the morning commute because it meant the bus had to pass the funeral director's office where I'd seen my dead father's body. I struggled at work, I had issues with noise, and the whole thing became very, very, very difficult. Now, the difference with complicated grief and common grief is that it doesn't come in bursts. It's sort of a constant feeling that makes you feel very, very trapped. And here it can really develop into quite serious mental illness or even self-harm behavior if you don't get treatment. If you experience this type of grief, I do really encourage you to seek professional help. I did, and I was treated for PTSD. I had a treatment called EMDR, which meant that only a few months later, I was in a much, much better space. There's also absent grief, and this is where a person silences their feelings and carries on as if nothing happens. So in very, very extreme versions, there's been stories of a woman who was now in her 80s who had lost her son 30 years before, and she absolutely refused to believe that he had passed away. So in our pandemic, we all lost our lives. And we didn't just, lose the opportunity of going to the office and being with our colleagues. We lost the commute to work. This might have been a really nice thing in your day because it was an hour for yourself with your headphones where you listen to music. You lost the connection to seeing your colleagues and spontaneous encounters. We lost the time away from our crazy families and the burden of our home lives and all those responsibilities that we have at home. We lost the ability to hug people that we love. So I think there's been lots and lots of reasons why people can feel a whole array of grief in response to the pandemic. And it is not just applicable to when someone dies. It's very difficult for people to talk about loss, and it's very hard for people to talk about their mental health. I can tell you, and I'm very happy to share this, when my father died, I lay in my bed for 2 weeks. I slept 18 hours a day and I had a complete inability to function as a human being. That's okay. This is normal. And I invite you to help me normalize speaking about grief and loss in your lives, in your communities, in your families, in your teams. It's time to end this stigma, and we can do so by being mindful of our process and mindful towards others. So, what can we learn from these different types of grief? Well, first of all, grief is a universal emotion. So the way we experience it, however, isn't. I remember a counselor who was helping me in my early days. I only had one session of bereavement counseling with Cruise Bereavement Care. I highly recommend them. And this woman said that each death or each bereavement is like a fingerprint. It's completely unique. I thought this was a really powerful thing for me to learn. The other thing I learned, and this completely shattered my entire world actually, was when 6 months later, when I began showing very severe symptoms, was a psychiatrist said to me that talking therapy wasn't actually that helpful. I said, "What do you mean?" And this I said, you know, I have flashbacks about my dead father's body in the living room. I need to talk to someone about this. But what he said is like, no, actually, there's other treatments for this. There's other science around this, but you have got to find your own way. You have got to find your own way. And the more mindful you are, the more you explore this, the more courage you have to go off and learn about these things, the better your odds are of moving forward from this. Now, in terms of some very useful models, so now we've gone through stages of grief and types of grief, I also still needed a model. How can I kind of get this straight in my head? And there was something I found by a woman called Professor Pauline Boss, who's over at the University of Minnesota. And she argues that grieving is not a linear process. So the stages I've just described are not actually in this nice, neat line. She writes, I quote, "There is no such thing as closure. In fact, the idea of closure leads us astray. It's a myth we need to put aside, like the idea that we've accepted that grief has 5 linear stages and that we must come out on the other side and be done with it." So Professor Boss argues that grief is a circular thing. It's not a linear thing. So now we're looking at grief in this little circle that's going round, and you might have depression, and then you might be accepting, and then you might get angry. But how else could I move forward with this, I wondered. And I then found the work by Dr. Lois Tonkin, who teaches the model of growing around grief. What does that mean? So you've got your little circle with all the different stages and so on. But I wanted to know, when is it over? When is the grief over? I am done with grief. When do I get over that ex-boyfriend who dumped me on an email? When do I get over that job that I lost? When do I get over this and this and this? Well, this wasn't a useful way of approaching it. Tonkin argues that we don't really move on from grief. We move forward and we grow around it. So if you think of that little circle and think of it maybe as a fried egg, so your grief is that little circle and you're going around in the different stages, and that's the egg yolk. But then as time passes, you'll have new experiences and you'll meet new people and you begin to find new moments of enjoyment. And this is what Dr. Tonkin argues, that you then grow around like the egg white. The size of your grief doesn't actually change, but life expands around it. So before I hand over to Ju, just to summarize, grief and loss are the only thing that we have in common, all of us, everyone on this call. There's various stages of grief. There's different types of grief. I believe, and a lot of people agree with me, that there's no formula of recovering from grief, but there is so much research and literature and so many support groups. And there's so much out there for you to explore it and to be curious. For anyone who attended my talk last week, I talk a lot about the traveler's mindset. So travel with your grief and explore it as if you're visiting a new country. The size of your grief doesn't change, but life expands around it. Now, I think of my grief the way I think about a beautiful, strong oak tree in my garden. So it's this massive, massive tree that's hundreds of years old, and I can lean on it on sunny days for shade. And when it rains, I can also stand under it for shelter. That was my dad, strong and powerful, someone to lean on. When he died, it felt like the big oak tree had died and had been chopped down. And suddenly what remained was this big giant trunk of a tree in the garden and a stump that something had died. It was the memory of something magnificent, but it was huge. But then as the months passed, the daffodils begin to bloom. And then suddenly the tulips come out, and then it's the lilac and the wisteria. And before you know it, the roses. The dead tree remained, but the garden began to bloom. And with that, it's my great pleasure to hand over to my very great friend, Ju. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinesha. I think this would also be a good point, perhaps, before I start speaking. If any one of you have anything to share or to ask, following Dinesha's incredibly open-hearted and vulnerable and honest piece, please feel free to do that in the chat box right now or at any time, really. And sort of not knowing each of you individually and the functions that you play in your private lives as well as in the professional context, I think it's important for me to just say, not necessarily as a disclaimer, but whether you're doing this for your own personal process dealing with grief, or whether you're helping somebody through this, or whether you're learning something that you can then perhaps teach and help other people with their grief through, work through their grief. When you're working with these processes, and I'll take you through a couple of processes here in the time that we've got left. By the way, Dinesh, sorry, just to remind me, how much time have I got?
Got about half an hour.
Great.
We've got till past.
Great. When you want to practice these things, try not to use something too big that could re-trigger or trigger something that might be difficult to manage on your own. It's like, you know, if you're gonna start with some DIY, start with something simple like changing a lock, or instead of building an entire house. Let's just in terms of working with exercises, you know, and things like that. So I will launch into this. Now, thank you, Dinesh, for talking about the 5-stage model, but also acknowledging that the 5-stage model has had very many responses around it. I'm not a psychotherapist myself. I'm not a professional counselor. However, I am in the process of being, I have studied grief and grief counseling, and I'm in the process of becoming accredited as a grief counselor myself. One of the things that has come up very frequently, repeatedly, is that we might be able to look back and look at it from a detached perspective, that grief has these 5 stages, but when we're in it and experiencing it, we don't have that objectivity. We don't have that perspective. We are in the moment fully, and we don't have the option of saying, okay, I'm at stage 3 of my grieving process. It doesn't feel like that. It just feels like, boom, you're in the middle of a crowded zoo and it's locked and you can't get out, or whatever it may be for you. So the first process, or first model that I'm going to introduce, is called RAIN, and is often used in mindfulness meditation. But today we're going to look at it with regards to grief and trauma specifically. And RAIN is an acronym. The R stands for recognize, A stands for acceptance, I stands for interrogation or investigation, and N stands for nurturing. Okay, so let's start with the R, with the recognition. So grief comes in all forms, as Dinesh has also mentioned. It might come in a moment of uncharacteristic shouting at your kids, or you know, somebody who's perfectly cool behind the wheel suddenly has road rage. It comes in all sorts of expressions. You might suddenly just burst into tears on the public transport. Whatever it may be for you, is when those moments occur, to recognize that that's what's going on. It may not be that you are depressed. It may not be that you are losing your mind. However, it might just be an expression that you are going through a form of grief, or that grief is coming out in this particular manifestation. So that's stage 1, to recognize that that's what's going in. That's what's coming out, rather. A, acceptance. It's merely that, is to give yourself time to catch yourself saying, okay, this is what's happening. I'm experiencing this. I'm going to allow myself to experience what's going on right now. And it's that simple fact of saying, okay, right now, this is what's going on, to accept it. The interrogation is, if you're in a situation where you might have a little bit more time, or you might come back to it later on in the day, is to maybe go back to what happened and dig under the surface a little bit more about what was that about? What was that feeling of injustice or sadness or whatever it was that was going through? What was that? What was underneath that about? And we'll go into a little tool that ties into that after this. And N, nurture, is that once you've gone through the process of investigating what it might be that lies behind that particular expression of grief, is to do something that can nurture this need that hasn't been met. Because grief is loss, and there is no other way of describing it. It is the loss of something that has created this emotion. So recognizing when it shows up, acknowledging the fact that it's there and allowing it to be there is the very first step. And then interrogating and nurturing it comes perhaps a little bit later. And with regular practice can perhaps be something that you do more instantly. And in order to do this interrogate and nurture part of this exercise, I'm going to ask you to get your pen and paper now and draw something that looks like this on your paper. So it's a sort of a square or a parallelogram in the middle, and then divide it into 4 quadrants. Yeah. And then in the top right quadrant, we're going to write mind, and then heart on the right, yeah, and then spirit and body. It doesn't really matter what order you choose to write these in, but these are the 4 quadrants: mind, heart, body, and spirit. And this is the model for what I call a self-prescription when it comes to working with grief. Right? And it can be used for a load of other things as well, but let's use this as the example for grief. Okay. So these 4 sections are in a lot of coaching and in a lot of professional development circles. Now, these are often also regarded as the 4 Qs. Some of you may have heard them referred to as the 4 Qs, which mine will be intelligence quotient, EQ, emotional quotient, PQ, physical, and spiritual. And obviously, spirit and spiritual are not used in any religious context in this example. But for this exercise, I rather take that sort of mental EQ, IQ stuff out of it and use specifically mind, heart, body, and spirit. So what goes into each of these quadrants? So this we do, remember, this is at the interrogation stage of working with your grief. So you've had something happen, whatever it may be, that has caused the trauma, that is causing the grief, and then you've had a reaction to that grief as you're going about your day-to-day, and you might be then coming back and revisiting it later on in the day, having had time to finish your work, put your feet up, etc. And you say, okay, I'm going to sort of reflect on my day. And this might be something that you do over the course of a month, maybe. Yeah. So in the mind quadrant, what we want to try and understand is, do I understand? So what do I understand of this situation? What are the words? And this is the rational, logical side of it. So to write down, note down all the logical things that you can think of that has come up or can come up in this process for you. Under the heart quadrant, it's, am I acknowledged? You know, am I acknowledged? Is my experience of this being acknowledged? And we were all brought up being taught how to walk, how to put a spoon or a fork in our mouth, how to say thank you, say please, how to go sit on the toilet. But none of, or very few of us, I would say, grew up being taught how to deal with grief In the same way, none of us grew up being taught how to be happy in life. These are certain life skills that very few of us grew up with a comfortable vocabulary and a comfort in discussing in day-to-day life. So in this heart quadrant again, am I acknowledged? What is the emotional aspect of me that needs to be heard, that needs to feel loved? And then body. What do I need? What do I need? And this is a question that's posed under the quadrant of body, because this is not an intellectual exercise. This is a physical one. When you get that wave of grief and however it arrives, how does that feel in the body? Is it heaviness? Is it tension? Is it weakness, fatigue? The need to run away? It manifests in different ways for all of us. To understand and work out what it is that you need to do to address this process for you, we're breaking it down to these 4 quadrants, and under the body part is really not an intellectual one. It might be that my stomach hurts, or I have a hollowness in my chest, or my jaw tenses up, or I can't stop crying. What do I need, and how? And these may not be the most perfectly worded questions, but these are, feel free to reword these for yourself as you use this model. What do I need? It's a physical need. Do I need a hug? Do I need to lie in the bath? Do I need to go for a walk? Do I need to eat something? Do I need to drink something? Do I need to brush my hair? Do I need to talk? Do I not need to talk? Yeah. Spirit, am I free? Now, this one is a really tricky one to describe every time I talk about it, because it means it could mean so many different things, but it really is that thing that we cannot define. It's that thing that nobody can define for you other than yourself. What is it that makes you feel free, that lifts your spirit, that lifts the corners of your mouth, that makes your eyes light up? What is it? What is that thing, that spark that might be missing right now? What makes you feel free? Yeah, that could be a nice way of phrasing it too. Yeah. And there is a gap in the middle. And this gap is a representation of what is missing. And you can write in this gap literally what is missing. The question, the words, what is missing, or you can write in this box the thing that is missing for you, whether it's the name of somebody who's passed on, whether it's the thing that has caused the grief, whatever it may be. And within this structure, this doesn't give you the answer, but by going through this exercise, you could find your way towards some very concrete, specific actions that you could then do something about. Because one of the most common things about grief is the feeling of helplessness, that there is nothing you can do about it. And yes, there is nothing you can do to speed up the process. There's nothing you can do to avoid it. However, when the various expressions of grief arise, there are many things that can be done to manage the process. So this is what I call the self-prescription for managing grief. Yeah. So we start with the rational, with the mind. What can I understand and articulate about this experience? From the heart space, am I being acknowledged? What is being acknowledged emotionally? What is not being acknowledged? Physically, what are my physical needs? Something really tangible. Spiritually, how can I feel free? Even if it's just for 5 minutes, even if it's just about standing under the shower for 5 minutes. Yeah. And to really acknowledge the loss, the space in the middle. What is missing here? Yeah. So this is the very simple, but I believe very potent little sheet of paper for managing the grief process. And I would like sort of to hear from you guys about questions about these, any thoughts, anything that might be coming up for you as you hear Dinesha and I speak about this. I'm going to open it up to the floor and to the other panelists.
I'll just ask a question here, Ju. So once I've sort of filled out some of these quadrants, then it's all on one page. How do I then tackle that? What's a good way? So I might have like, okay, you know, I need to go to the gym, or I need to go for a massage, or I need to go on a holiday, or, you know, then it's on a page, but then how do I then deal with that?
I guess it's then it's down to a very pragmatic solution of what it is that you feel is available and is going to be most useful at this point in time. And the more familiar and the more easily this exercise is performed, after a while you might realize that actually the mind stuff you're cool with. You've got that, you know, you might be talking to somebody about it already, you might be going to counseling, that might be cool already. You know, you might be having regular catch-ups with your mom, for example. I'm just using that as an example in this. So maybe that acknowledgement part, you know, maybe you've got your siblings, your other circle of friends who are really supporting you. You might feel that, okay, actually I am being heard. And that expression of grief, there may not be such urgent actions in these two boxes, but it might be in one of these lower ones, like, okay, I actually need to physically get away from here. So what can I do about it right now? So once you've articulated all the things that are out there, my experience with this is there will be one thing that naturally calls, say, okay, do this. If at any point it starts to feel all overwhelming, then obviously just, you know, put it down, walk away, leave it for another day. But what normally would happen is after some time, the more easily you start to fill in these 4 boxes, there might be patterns that are coming up. Oh, actually, these things trigger the mind things. These things trigger the spirit thing.
So it's not just a one-off thing. It's
no, something you can do every single time.
Yeah.
Every single time you're hit by a wave of grief. I mean, obviously, if you're still in the middle of Sainsbury's, don't you may not want to be getting out your notepad and drawing this thing. But every time it happens, it might be useful to just have as a useful tool, but to not get attached to. You know, it's an outlet. It's an outlet to empower yourself. Yes, many of us have access to therapists and can go and speak to someone about it. Many of us can't afford it, don't have access to it. Many of us grew up in families where they're not emotionally equipped to talk about it. And many cultural, religious contexts come into play here often as well, where people think that, okay, in my family, certainly it's like, you know, we just don't talk about it. You know, we have the funeral process. If somebody dies, we have the funeral process.
There's no vocabulary.
There's no vocabulary about dealing with the emotions afterwards.
Yeah.
There is the mourning period, and then everyone is expected to have experienced their grief through the mourning period, and then we move on. And for many people, many of the grief counselors that I have spoken to say, you know, the difficult part of the grief actually is the unexpected bouts that come sometime after. And I don't know, you know, from your personal experience, that might be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think many of you on the call probably agree. Please do share some of your experiences of when you've had grief in the last, if you feel comfortable doing so, and it's okay if you don't. But this is so silly, but I was in the highest restrictions of lockdown with my very clinically vulnerable mother. And it wasn't until I went back to the supermarket for the first time after 1 year that I suddenly felt that I had been grieving just wanting to go to the supermarket and being able to just like pick up some fresh bananas rather than fiddling around on an app trying to get a delivery slot, you know. And I very slowly in the last few weeks have started realizing the extent of my pandemic grief. You know, I was grieving the fact that I couldn't just jump on a bus and be taken somewhere, you know, I'd like to put on some music and so on. You know, or even just having a, you know, sitting in a restaurant and having a pizza nice hot on the plate, you know, the pleasure of that rather than a soggy one that comes with it. These are little things, but they make up the mosaics of our lives, don't they, Ju? I've got here someone sharing that, Judy, thank you, that you still struggle with the loss of several family members, including her twin sister nearly 30 years ago. And at this point of the year, in this season of the year, Judy gets very low and it sort of catches her by surprise. Is this normal? What do you think, Drew? I think it is, but I'll let you go first.
Of course it is, Judy. I mean, of course it absolutely is. It absolutely is. It's normal and it's valid and it's important. And what I guess my question to you that's coming up would be, instead of potentially looking at this time of year as a little surprise, could you potentially look at celebrating their memory, using this time of year as an opportunity to celebrate their memory in a different way, so that you schedule it in and you see it and you plan for it?
Yeah, it's
obviously we don't know the context of it, and we don't know your context, and I don't want my comments to be taken as an insensitive remark, but as I'm reading, I'm just sort of opening up to what's showing up in what's coming through, and that's what's coming through for me.
No, I agree with you, Drew, and Judy, I go through the same thing. Around November, which is when I lost my father, I physically respond to the change of the weather because I remember what the weather felt like when we had this massive loss in our family. And just being aware of it was the first step. So going back to what Jules was recommending in his model of rain, right? Just recognizing that this was happening. It also meant for me that this is a little bit strategic, but it's almost aligning with the biorhythm of my grief and saying, this is the rhythm of my grief. At this time of the year, usually something kind of happens. So what does that mean? How does that look for me? In November, I might do 4-day weeks, or I might do half days, or I might work from home. I mean, at the moment, we're all working from home, but in normal circumstances. And I just gently sort of keep an awareness that I'm going to be gently and radically kind to myself. Everyone I know experiences that. And it's also really, really important to go and find community, and maybe people that are not in your work community or in your family community, complete strangers that you can go and talk to. So I really recommend an initiative called the Death Cafe. If you all look it up, and it was started, I believe, in Canada. And the concept is that you get together and there's tea and cakes, or it's virtual, and you have a positive dialogue on death. It's not a therapy group, but you know, that would be a really nice thing where, you know, you sort of say, okay, around November, I probably need to make sure I go to a few death cafes and talk to people about death and say, hi, I'm feeling low. I lost several family members. I lost my twin sister. It was 30 years ago, but it's still happening to me now. It's a very real thing.
And to use this model in terms of this scenario, you know, the mind rational stuff is kind of what you've described as well. Is it 30 years ago, this thing happened and these people died? Yeah. Now, this are the other bits that, you know, you'll have to explore a little bit more. Like, what is this that's still being unacknowledged in your heart? How does it still feel when this feeling arrives for you this time of year? Is there any kind of expression of it in your body? Is there any heaviness? Is there any sobbing? Is there any tension? Is there, sometimes it can be even indigestion and stuff like that? how does it manifest at the physical level? And then this is really quite, I guess, more arbitrary. You'll have to explore this for yourself. Like, how could I feel a little bit more free? And my suggestion there, in terms of feeling a little bit more free, was that perhaps if we flipped it and scheduled it so that there was something of a ritual that you create for yourself in their memory this time of year, so that you plan for it and look towards it, so that it doesn't hit you unawares.
So a ritual could be, this is a very, very personal thing, isn't it, Ju? And, one of my rituals is that I walk the same walk that I used to go with my dad. We used to walk along the river to the same pub. And whenever I feel this sort of sense of wanting him walking next to me in some way, I just go off and do that. I've also caught myself going into restaurants and ordering his favorite dish. And I just sort of feel that and go, okay, well, let's just have the steak and chips, because this is just something I would be around if my dad was there. And some of these things might seem very silly to you. Some people want to, in Asian cultures, it's actually very widespread practice. They serve a plate of food for their beloved and they leave it on the table. So this is a very big thing to do, but they serve a plate of food and that person still has a seat at their table. So if that works for you, go for it. There's no one there to define what ritual you need to feel more connected.
Yeah, my mother still does that for her parents and her grandparents, and it's a difficult one, because it's a tradition that, interestingly, my mother has been very reluctant to teach me and my sister.
Yeah, no, that's very, very strange. I mean, I've also had other days where we have in our tradition, we have annual ceremonies that we have to go and do at the temple. But last year we just didn't feel like it. So we just went, well, what would we normally do if Dad was here? Well, we'd watch TV and we'd watch X Factor, So that's what we did, and we ordered a pizza. And fine, it didn't mean we went to the temple and laid flowers and did a whole big thing about death. It was no, let's just kind of be normal about this and go, well, this is what we would have done if he was here. So
yes.
I love this idea here. Thank you, Caroline. I light a candle for my loved ones or buy a plant for my garden. I really like the idea of plants in particular. We talked about the garden analogy here, but especially when you're throwing a seed into something that will grow and that you can nurture and that you can see evolve. I think that always brings in a ray of hope.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That's really, really lovely. And also the symbolism of the candle. Every tradition, every civilization in the world has traditions around light. And there's a certain magic just about having a connection to a light practice.
Thank you for also bringing up the Death Cafe, because the Death Cafe was also started by a group of people who work in a field called soul midwifery. So in the same way that there are birth doulas, there are death doulas. And this whole concept of the Death Cafe was started by a group of people, and it's a growing profession. And you can definitely find people in the UK very easily. And it's very useful for people who are working with or living with people with terminal diseases, for example, so that you can have a positive conversation. They will come in the midwife context, come in and work with the individual who is dying, and also come in and work with the family as a conduit, but also listen directly to the family and relay the intentions and preferences of the person who is dying to the family.
Wow.
The person who's dying might actually want to be cremated and have their ashes scattered on the beach, for example, which might go completely against any traditions of the family, which in the mind of the members of the family would supersede that. And so this midwife comes in as the interlocutor to take the wishes of the dying individual, to work with the dying individual to say, okay, so tell me where exactly and why, and then take that and then present that. It's because as a family, this person has beautiful memories of this beach, and this is the one place that this person feels free and will be eternally present in your memories and in their memories. And that's why he or she wants this. And then it's easier for the family to hear it from this third party, not from the dying person.
I think the power of an external person coming in is very, very, is largely underestimated. When my best friend's father died, they needed a Muslim funeral, which has to happen very quickly. And then I was suddenly there in the situation where I was helping the family choose coffins and whatever. But the fact that I was an external person, an external presence, was very, very powerful. And I think this is also something to be mindful of, that it's okay to say to other people, like, hi, I need a hand here. I'm dealing with something. It doesn't just have to be around death. It could be the fact that you're divorcing, or even just the end of your relationship. Many years ago, there was a fascinating exhibition called the Museum of Broken Relationships. So this is a concept started in Zagreb in Croatia. It's a touring exhibition, and people bring in objects of their broken relationships. So it can be a jewelry, it can be a picture frame, it can be a stuffed teddy bear. And then these objects are all exhibited like this kind of really weird thing. But just the fact of giving people the space to come in and say, I'm grieving the loss of my relationship, my heart broke. And on the little placards, instead of saying this was the artist or whatever, were all the descriptions of the broken stories. And then also anyone who has heard of the Burning Man Festival over in America, they have something, I think it's called, is it called the temple or whatever, but everyone brings in things that they want to burn together. And everyone gets together and they build this monument of something they're willing to let go. And this again is a really powerful ritual, isn't it, Ju? That I've also done. I mean, you don't always have to go off and burn objects, but you could write something on a piece of paper. In Asian and also in some South American traditions, we believe that full moon is a good time to let things go. New moon is a time of rebirth, and full moon is a good time to let go. And you know, you just go off and throw that into something and burn it and have a ritual around that. Thank you, Judy, is sharing that she planted an agapanthus in her garden in memory of her brother, and that this offers her lots of comfort. I imagine this is also a long-standing loss. Judy, thank you for sharing. It's really beautiful.
I mean, one of the things that these various tools come in particularly useful and powerful, as well as when people are also in the process of dying, which technically we all are, is to acknowledge the grief up front. Obviously, someone with a terminal disease is very much more front and center and coming at them much faster. But to start the conversation of grief, start the process of grieving much sooner. And many of you may have experienced or yourselves or seen where you might have a surviving spouse of somebody who has died from cancer, for example, for whom after the death itself, the grieving doesn't seem to be that severe because the process of grieving started much sooner for the spouse who lived through that process with the deceased. And I've seen that as many cases of that, which happens to be true. And for them, for couples that I have worked with in that situation, the ones who have seemed to come out of it sooner after the death of one of them, of the couples, one of the people there, I'll use this, you know, he survived and his wife died. After his wife died, he pretty much was ready to go into another relationship, because over the course of the 2 years that his wife took from diagnosis to death, they talked through the death process on a regular basis. They did not ignore it. Unfortunately for her, it was terminal. There was no question about X amount of therapy, X amount of surgery is going to save you. This is a one-way street. And so they dealt with it face on. And after 2 years, well, for everybody else outside of that marriage, it was a very difficult death. But for him, it was much less severe.
You've taken a mindful approach, yes.
Obviously, it has different repercussions about then everyone saying, well, how come you're so okay? You know, your wife just died. But anyway, that's a whole other thing.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ju. That was really, really fascinating to get a toolkit, a very simple but powerful toolkit. I hope that everyone who stayed on the call, thank you so much for being here. I hope that you got a few things that you can take away with you that are helpful to you. Please do get in touch. I'm going to just send you the details right now in the panel here in the chat, and may you stay well and happy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all.
Bye. Bye.